right, thank you. Thank you for having us here today. I wanted to start by just giving a brief outline. I've divided my comments today into three sections. First, briefly, I'll just talk about background just so people have a sense of who I am. Second, I'll talk about my campaign priorities. There are four. And then finally, I'll talk about small minority and women's business issues. So that's sort of an overview. I was born in Bellevue, born and raised in Bellevue, graduated from Bellevue High School, went to Dartmouth College, graduated in 1984 with a degree in history and economics, graduated cum laude. And since that time, I've pursued two careers, very different careers as it turns out. First was as a management consultant in Washington, D.C. for 10 years. And I worked with a firm called Strategic Planning Associates. Perhaps people have heard of McKinsey or the Boston Consulting Group. Those were our competitors. Our firm was actually a spin-off of the Boston Consulting Group. And we had offices in the States, Canada, Europe, and we gave advice to the senior members, senior management of large corporations on issues of business strategy. So I worked during that time for General Electric's turbine generator business, Norfolk Southern's North American Van Lines business, Ralston Purina's agricultural business, and a number of other very large corporations. And the work entailed gathering financial data, operating data, competitive data, industry data, analyzing it statistically, and using that as the basis for making recommendations to firms for how they can change their business direction. I started as a research analyst, and I was promoted 5 times over a period of about 5.5 years to become one of the youngest partners in the history of the firm. So that was my first career, management consulting profession. I then pursued the second career, which I'm currently involved in, which is in education. I went to Howard University in Washington, D.C., and started my work in teaching education. Came back to Washington State and earned my master's in teaching from St. Martin's College in 2000. And then for the last decade, I worked, believe it or not, literally almost every single day as a substitute teacher for Seattle schools. And to say that that's been eye-opening for me is a tremendous understatement. It's been sort of a shocking experience in many respects, but I also think it's provided me with sort of a useful experience, both to understand the education issues, but also to understand sort of the deeper issues at work in our society that are sort of at the root of a lot of the problems within our society. So that's a little bit about my background. I'm running for really 3 reasons. First, I do believe my background's meaningful in terms of the business, economics, and education background, but also I believe I possess sort of 2 qualities that I think our political system is in much need of at this time. First, thought independence. I sort of develop my own proposals, do a lot of reading, and second, going along with that, I believe I have a very direct, no-nonsense approach to communicating my views. So with that as sort of a transition, let me talk about what my specific views are. So these are my 4 priorities for the upcoming campaign, or for this campaign. First, the state needs to dramatically reduce its spending. I don't know if that's been talked about enough significantly today. It's a big issue. Doing so, of course, will enable the state to pass on lower taxes to its businesses, so that's important. And here I have sort of 3 big proposals. First, I think the state should exit businesses in which it's non-competitive. And unlike most people in my party, I think the state should get out of the liquor store business. I think it's inherently non-competitive to have a whole distribution channel established for one product category. There's an argument that says this will hurt the state's finances because the state currently has a state markup and state taxes on liquor. It will, according to this argument, lose the markup portion and therefore have a lower sort of tax increment on alcohol, and therefore will lose funding. My view is that the state can and should recapture that tax portion on alcohol after it privatizes it and have that spread out over more volume, which it does raise social issues, but over more volume to actually help the state's financial picture. So that's my view on that issue. I also believe the state should get out of the printing business, and I think there may be some other opportunities to exit businesses as well. Second, in the businesses that the state is involved in, I think there's opportunities to reduce the scope of the services that it provides to also save money. A couple examples would be healthcare, have the state move out of secondary and ancillary provision of services such as vision and podiatry. And in corrections, Senator Klein has talked about The idea of increased use of drug and alcohol courts to focus more on treatment and less on incarceration, and I think I support those efforts as well, and I think those will save the state money in the longer term. Finally, in terms of reducing the state spending, is the cost of providing services themselves. This is a painful recommendation, but I do support the idea of having public employees pay more for their health care premiums from the current 12% up to, say, roughly 24%. The governor proposed that a couple weeks ago. It is difficult, but I do support that. And taken collectively, I think progress in these three areas will enable the state to lower its cost structure pretty significantly. Second sort of campaign pillar, Senator Gordon talked about tax exemptions, and I have my own list. What's interesting about my list, and I won't go through it now because of the comments Senator Gordon made, but what's interesting is I was familiar with all of the ones he talked about, and yet my list is altogether different. And I think that speaks to the fact that there are a lot of tax exemptions that shouldn't be on the books. He talked about a couple $100 million of potential there. My suspicion is it's actually quite a bit higher than that, and I think this is a big issue. And I think it's sort of irresponsible to talk about inflicting pain from the standpoint of reducing expenditures without doing the other side of things, which is taking away a lot of these exemptions. And let me talk about what I specifically propose here. I think the inefficient approach is to go at these one exemption at a time. This is talked about every year. Exemptions don't come off the books. New ones are added. And I think the whole thing needs to be rethought and turned on its head. So specifically, I propose the following. The state has no exemptions that don't automatically sunset. And everything sunsets in two tranches, either 5 years or less or 10 years. And the only way that they can reoccur is if they face an up or down vote in the state legislature where the senators and representatives actually have to put their name on to the line that says, I vote for the continuation of this exemption. Otherwise, they automatically expire. And I would also like to link this to the state auditor's department so that when something's going to face an up or down vote on the legislature, Brian Sontag and company, so to speak, prepare a cost-benefit analysis publicly available. Here's what we see in terms of the costs and the benefits for these. And the idea here is not to repeal 1 or 2 or 3 exemptions confronting a lot of work from lobbyists, but instead see 10s and 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s of these exemptions come off the books, which I think is what's necessary. These things stay in the dark after they get put on. And I think we should all be appalled at the example he talked about and many others. Coca-Cola getting a tax exemption when the rest of us have a hard time finding jobs and paying taxes is galling. So anyway, I think the whole process needs to be rethought there. Third thing, tax reform. I do support 1098, the income tax, with a somewhat compensatory decrease in other taxes, B&O, property and sales taxes. Some of the reasons for doing this have been articulated by other speakers. We do have the most aggressive tax structure in the nation. That's very concerning. I also believe the state needs a modest tax increase to go along with spending and exemption reductions to meet its budget situation, and it also links to something that I'm going to get at next, which is the need for the state to begin the process of investing in education longer term. So I strongly support the state income tax. I also support B&O reform. A number of people have talked about that. It seems pretty straightforward to me. Get rid of the tax on gross receipts and have it be a tax on profits. That also it's worth noting that that's especially desirable in a slow economy because it supports startups who oftentimes confront prolonged periods of losses before achieving profitability, and to tax that is very detrimental during a recession. Final thing, the 4 pillars, education reform. So a number of concerning things about our state education system. We're 36th in the country in per pupil education spending, K-12, despite being a high per capita personal income state. That's very concerning. We're in the lowest quintile of states in the percentage of our 19-year-olds that pursue higher education. Seattle School Districts has a dropout rate in the 30% range. Those are very concerning things, and we're kidding ourselves if we don't think those are going to have big impacts on business productivity over the longer term. Without going into a lot of details on my proposals for education, I'd say the first, over the long term, I think the state does need to have an eye towards increasing its investment in education. And the primary thing that I'd like to see that go towards is more substantive time in the classroom for students. Some combination of longer school year, longer school day, perhaps fewer professional development days for teachers, more early learning programs, and an increased focus on core subjects within the state. So those are the 4 proposals that sort of form the basis of my campaign, again summarizing state cost reduction, exemption reform, tax reform, and education investment. Finally, comments on minority and women business issues and small businesses as well. And I think it is appropriate to talk, just to put my cards on the table regarding philosophy. In here, I don't support mandatory targets for minority and women business enterprises and public contracting. I do, however, support efforts to promote minority and women business enterprise participation in the contracting process. I think it's good for society, good for the economy, and initiatives in this area can help level the playing field, and sort of there's 2 dimensions that are important to me there. First, smaller businesses have the issue of being at a disadvantage in terms of scale economies, both in terms of responding to RFQs, RFPs, also in performing the work, also in establishing their viability. And I think initiatives that help sort of alleviate that or address that are worthy initiatives. And also newer businesses have a hard time dealing with the fact that they are not entrenched and have a long history of dealing with the state, which puts them at a disadvantage. So supporting efforts that support minority and women business enterprises are useful because they can help address those concerns. And specific things that I support, I do support voluntary goals for state agencies and public contracting for minority and women's business enterprises. I support the OMWBE's efforts to increase participation, the certification process, the directory, training programs, advances in e-procurement such as the web system, etc. I think those are all sound ideas. I also support contracting strategies that increase the odds of small business success, multi-source contracting being one of them. The linked deposit program came up earlier. I think that's a sound program. And the community capital development program, I also think that's a sound program. And I also support efforts to streamline, simplify, and standardize the RFQ and RFP processes, as gains in those areas will disproportionately help smaller businesses who don't have the scale to handle those things in a cost-effective manner. And finally, I support thorough reporting and transparency in public contracting. I think that also tends to benefit small firms disproportionately. I have a couple other things on other business issues, and maybe I'll sort of be brief here and not go through each of them. Workers' comp, I don't support the privatization of that at this time. This is a very difficult issue. It's difficult to find meaningful apples-to-apples comparisons across states in this area, but I'd say one concern I have is cherry picking when you introduce private firms into a publicly provided service. The private firms have an incentive to go after the easier to serve, lower cost firms, leaving the state to serve the others. The proposal tries to address that to some extent, but I still have concerns about it. So at this time, I don't support the privatization of workers' comp. Infrastructure spending, obviously investments in transportation during a recession are a desirable thing in my opinion. They provide stimulus and jobs in the short term. Also establish an improved infrastructure to support longer term economic growth. So I think it's a very good time for the state to move forward with the tunnel, SR 520 replacement, and other major projects statewide. One thing that hasn't come up today is the issue of global warming and a carbon tax. And I think this also has to be a priority for the state. My view is the science on global warming is very clear. I'm not an expert. Just about nobody else that I hear on TV that pretends to be an expert do I consider to be an expert. But the good news is there are experts, and every one of them I listen to says that this is just a very clear issue, and I think we're remiss if we don't move to address it. So personally, I favor a direct tax on carbon emissions over a cap and trade system, although a cap and trade is definitely better than nothing at all. There are, of course, issues with implementing this at a local level rather than a national or international level because it raises issues of equity. But suffice it to say that I do support movement in this area.
John, if you could wrap up.
Okay, I'll wrap up. I guess I'll close by saying, without going through other things on my business list, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today, and if people have questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you very much.
Thank you.